But yeah, welcome to this workshop. I'm super excited to be leading this. This is actually the first workshop that I'll have led. So this has been a very fun experience getting this put together. And I'm just really excited to see how this goes. This is the advanced workshop for the Prisma and MongoDB general availability release. So that's a super exciting release that a lot of people have been really looking forward to. And it's going to be cool to walk through some of the more nitty-gritty features and enhancements that we've released to work with. Throughout this workshop, I'll be working in this Notion document, and I will share a link to this. Let me go ahead and copy this link. And this Notion document is going to be basically the hub for this workshop. We're going to have all of our prerequisites, a lot of instructions, and the agenda, and our lesson set up here. And I'll walk through all of that in a second. But first, I'll just go ahead and post this link in the chat. Feel free to pop that open and start looking around in there. But I'll just go ahead and give a little bit of an overview of what this has. Very first here, we have our resources section. And this will just have a link to this Notion document in case you need that there. And then right below that is a link to the GitHub starter project for this workshop. This is going to be sort of the base project that we'll be working off of. So we're going to need to install that at some point. And I think in the first lesson down here, I'll walk you through those steps. In order to follow along successfully with me, you are going to need to have a couple of things installed. We are going to be running a Node development server, so you will need Node.js installed on your machine if it's not already. You also need a GitHub account just so you can access this repository that we're working off of. And then down here, a code editor installed, preferably VS Code. I recommend using VS Code because we have a lot of nice extensions that we can install to help make it a little bit easier to work with Prisma and get some of that nice auto completion. But whichever editor you prefer to use, feel free to use that one. And then, of course, a basic understanding of schemaless database concepts. We are going to be working with MongoDB, and I'll be talking about some of the a little bit deeper concepts in a schemaless database environment. So just a basic understanding would be good. It's not completely necessary. I'll try to explain myself as I go, but that would just be good to have. And then this last one that I skipped over here, have Docker installed on your machine. This is a more optional step. I'll be using an Atlas database to connect to and store data in. However, I do have a Docker Compose file in the repository linked where you can spin up a Mongo database on your own that you can just go ahead and connect right to. And I will walk through those steps once we get to that point. But before we get into the lessons, let's go ahead and just get an overview of what we're actually going to be doing in this workshop. So what I have put together for us is basically an entire application. During the general availability release of the Prisma and Mongo integration, I've been putting together a 5-step series of blog posts and videos where we're building a full stack application. And that application has pretty much any feature that a modern web application would have. It has authentication. It's got pretty much real-time user interactions where you can send messages to and each other. And then it also has things like image uploads and just a bunch of other cool features in there. So it's a full-fledged application, and it's all running on MongoDB with Prisma. And what I've done for this workshop is I've actually stripped out anything related to database interactions, and I've stripped out anything related to Prisma. And it's going to be our job today to add that in and make our site functional. The current state of the website is that it has all static data. So you could still go into the website once we get it installed, and we can actually pop it open and see what it looks like. However, it's going to be static data until we get through all of our pieces. So that's going to be pretty fun, I think. We'll get to see it slowly come together, and by the end of it, we should have a fully working application. To accomplish this, I have split up our agenda here into pretty much 4 lessons, and we'll be going through those one at a time from top to bottom. And the very first one is going to be setting up Prisma and a MongoDB database and modeling out some of the data for our users and basically creating a users collection and defining what that should look like. And then we're going to learn a little bit along the way about how a schema fits into a schemaless world, because MongoDB is a schemaless JSON store. So this whole concept of adding a schema on top of it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. And I'm going to try to talk along the way about how this fits into that role. And after that, we'll use the data model we created to actually add all of our user interactions, basically anything involving authentication with login and registration. We're going to make all of that stuff functional. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll have built a couple of Prisma queries from pretty simple queries to slightly more complex ones. And then we'll sort of repeat the process of the first two steps with Kudos data. So the Kudos are going to be like posts in this application. The whole point of the application is you can send Kudos to other members and just congratulate them or let them know they did a good job on something. So we're going to actually, after these first two steps, we're going to model that data out. And we'll set up a little bit more of complex interactions there with relations and referential integrity actions. And we'll just take a little look into how Prisma can solve some of the gotchas that might pop up when you're working on a larger project with a schemaless database. And then, yeah, we'll build all the queries for the Kudos interactions and basically allow users to post Kudos and search and filter those. And then by the end of it, as I mentioned, we'll have a full application. And here's the agenda here. All of the times are in Central Eastern time. And so I am looking at probably around an hour and a half or maybe closer to 2 hours, depending on how things go. But I do want to highlight that this project and specifically this Notion document is set up in a way where you can actually accomplish all of these tasks on your own if you follow through each lesson. Clicking on these individual pages will give you basically a tutorial style walkthrough of how to accomplish each individual task that we'll cover. So if you do have to dip out early for any reason, you can always come back to this document and follow through the rest of it on your own if you'd like. As we're going through these lessons, we are going to have a couple of different sections that I want to highlight. The first part is going to be the host walkthrough, and this is going to be the section where I'm going through the code and sort of explaining my thought process and explaining various concepts that I would like to highlight. And I do just suggest that you be attentive during that time and sort of just listen and watch. This is your time to really learn and see these concepts being played out in front of you. And then after I do that portion of it, you'll have time to actually do some coding on your own. So I just do suggest don't code during that time. Just soak in all the information you can, and you will have some time afterwards to do the tasks on your own. And then the last point here is this do-it-yourself point. Hosting workshops is super fun. I've seen a lot of people do it. This is my first one, but I have been super excited for it, and it's been really cool to put together. And actually, this Notion document is sort of based off of my coworker Nicholas's document that he tends to use on a lot of his workshops. And it's set up in a way where if you want to host this workshop on your own, you can take this document, and all the tools to host this are basically built into here. So you would have very little setup, and it would just be maybe a good experience for you to host it. So if you're interested in doing that, by all means, feel free to steal this document and do whatever you wish with it. Now, just a little bit about myself. My name is Sabin Adams, and I live in California. It's a bright and early 6 a.m. right now. And I recently started as a developer advocate at Prisma. I've spent probably, it shows around 8 years here, but I've actually probably been in the field around maybe closer to 9 or 10 years, working as a full stack developer on various teams. So I've worked on really small teams and really big teams. So I feel like I've had a pretty good variety there. And it's just been a whole lot of fun. And I'm really excited to be in this role now where I can sort of take some of those experiences and share it with you guys. If you have any questions during or after this workshop, feel free to reach out to me on any of these mediums, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this first lesson here. So I'm going to click on the Setup Prisma page over here under Lessons. and we'll go through these setup steps. And the goal of this first lesson is to just set up your Prisma in your application, model out the data that you need for the next lesson, which will be the user's data, and create an instance of the Prisma client that'll be shared throughout your application. And so to set this up, we're going to need to actually clone our repository from GitHub. So I'll click on this link here, and that should take you right to the repository. If you're following along with me, you will find this green button up at the top corner, and you can hit copy here on that, and then open up a terminal. Clear out some of these messages here and bump up the font size a little bit. Awesome, there we go. So I'm going to run the command git clone, and I'll paste in the URL here that we got. And that'll just clone the project down into my local file directory. Could not create working tree, no such file or directory. You know what, I'll copy this right here, the HTTPS one. There we go. So it's copying there, and now we should have the project installed. In this project, there is a README, and it has a couple of setup steps. So if you're going to be following along on your own at some point on this, you can follow these steps. It just walks you through cloning the repository, installing your dependencies, and then starting up the MongoDB instance via Docker if you choose to do it that way. So I'll actually follow those steps here. I'm going to cd into the directory. And I'm realizing right now this directory that I have here is actually the wrong one. It's going to be called Prisma MongoDB Advanced Workshop. So if that trips you up, it's because of the naming difference there. And once inside that project, we will run npm I to install all of our dependencies. And while that's installing, I'll just take a quick look at the chat, see how everything's going. Cool, doesn't look like there's any questions, so I will move on. We have our project now installed. We have our dependencies, hopefully those are going. And it looks like they did, so I will open this up. Because I'm using VS Code, I can do code dot, and hitting that will pop open the repository for me. And so let's just take a quick look at what we get to start off. This is a remix application, and I'll actually open up the terminal and run it so you can see what this looks like. But this application is, as I mentioned, fully fleshed out aside from the database interactions. We have a bunch of different components in here that we won't really touch, but those are here, and a couple of different routes that set up the routing of our application. And then the main piece that we're going to be actually looking at throughout these lessons and throughout this whole workshop is in utils. This is where any like service files would go. This is where our users service files and Kudos service files are. So we'll be touching a lot of the pieces in there. But I'll run npm run dev to get this guy going. And we'll pop it open and see what the initial application looks like. Looks like there's a version issue here. Oops. There we go. So npm run dev. And yeah, your installed ES build on a different platform. Not sure what that is. Let me look at this really quick. So I'm running into this weird issue where it's not running because of a version difference. I doubt most of you guys will be running into the same issue. When this runs, it should open up a development server at localhost 3000 and it'll spit out a link. And you can go ahead and pop that open and you'll see the resulting application. I think between maybe this lesson and the next lesson, I'll take a quick look at what might be going on here and hopefully I'll be able to pull it up for you guys and show you it. But fortunately, we don't really need to see that for now. The next piece that we're actually going to be worrying about is setting up Prisma in the application. So I'll head over back to the Notion document. And we've got a set of tasks, and each lesson is going to have this sort of similar format. We'll be given a bunch of different tasks to go through, and it'll have a short description of what the task is and maybe a couple of hints on how to complete it. And at the bottom, you'll see a drop-down with a solution. And that will contain the code that will solve the task. So I do recommend you try to figure those out on your own a little bit. Maybe try to type everything out on your own. And then if you either finish the task and you want to see how your solution compares to the solution here, or if you do get stuck, you can always pop this guy open and see what you got. But I will go ahead and start on this though. So the very first thing is setting up the connection string in your Prisma setup. And to do that, we need to actually initialize Prisma. So I'm going to go into the code here and run npx Prisma init. And we are hooking up to a Mongo database. So I can actually use this nice flag -- data source provider. And I can specify MongoDB. And that'll just scaffold this out as a MongoDB connection by default. If you didn't add that, it would normally use Postgres as a default value. But when we added that in, it creates this Prisma folder and it sets up our provider as MongoDB. And so this is just going to let our project know that we're going to connect to a MongoDB database. And this env that you see here, this is reaching into the process.env variables. And it's going to look for a variable called database URL to get our connection string. So let's go ahead and set that up. You will see right over here, it created a .env file for us, and that's super nice. It gives us a couple of comments on how to use this. But the thing that we're going to care about is actually pasting in our connection string here. So you can either use the connection string that I've provided in the document here if you are using the Docker compose file to spin up your instance locally. Otherwise, if you're using Atlas, you can reach into your Atlas instance and get that connection string yourself. That's what I'm going to do because I have an Atlas instance up and running. So I will go over here and hit connect and connect my application. And I'll copy this guy over. And the piece missing here is the password. So I'll have to retrieve that as well. I go to database access. I'll click over to this guy and auto-generate a new password and copy it. And then I'll update my user. And I do have this Mongo database instance locked down as far as the network access goes. So fear not, I'm not sharing my private details with you. This is a safe interaction here. Okay, so we've got that piece set up. Let's see how this compares to the solution here. And it looks pretty good. We did our npx Prisma init, initialized Prisma, and then we set up our env file. And so the next piece is going to be actually beginning to model out our data, which this is the part where it seems to get weird for people. We're in a schemaless database system. Why are we setting up a schema on top of our database? And that's really a sort of a mindset thing. It's a little bit of a misconception with schemaless databases. The intention for a schemaless database isn't to have a database with no structure and no way of knowing what shape your data should be in. That would be craziness. If you're working on a big project or with a big team, things would get unwieldy really quick. If you had no sort of structure, you would rely completely on documentation. And as things got outdated, that would just get pretty scary. So what Prisma is doing here and what most ORMs over Mongo database would do is it's basically just shifting your schema definition from the database side to your application layer. That way it can scale a little bit quicker and be versioned with your code. And so that's the difference there. That's why we're setting up a schema, is that we just want to get some of that structure. We'll get some nice typings and auto completion. And then we'll also get more insight into what our data looks like and how different pieces of data relate to each other if we do set up a schema. And so down here, as I showed you just a second ago, your schema should look something like this to start off. It's just got a generator, which lets Prisma know to generate Prisma client for us when we run a generate or db push command. And then we've got our database interaction here. But the piece that we need to add is the user model. So I'm going to pop open my code and we'll get one of those started. But actually, I guess before I pop that open, I will talk through a couple of these items. So we are going to be setting up a couple of different fields. This one here is going to be a special one that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail, where it's going to map to the underlying auto-generated column that MongoDB gives us. And then a couple of these are going to be more just normal fields. These are going to be date times. This will be a string field. It'll just hold an email. And then a password will be just another string. It's going to hold a hashed version of a password. But this profile one here, this is another special one. This is going to be an embedded document. So in MongoDB, you can actually embed documents within other documents to have deeply nested data. So I'm going to walk through how to set one of those up in your Prisma schema. So let's head back over to the schema. And we'll pop this open. And to start off our first user model, which is basically end up being a collection once we push this, we'll do model user. And when you're using MongoDB, every model needs to have a ID field that maps to the underlying underscore ID field. So until we add one of those, we're going to see this squiggly line if we've got the IntelliSense and auto completion going. If you don't, you can actually add that using this extension. There's an official Prisma extension, so I'll just search for that here. And yeah, it's this one here. If you install this, you should get some nice autocomplete, and it ends up being very helpful because as you're typing out your schema, if you ever are unsure about how to set something up, usually the auto-completion will give you some helpful tips on where to go next, and that's helped me a lot in the past. So let's start this guy off. We're going to have a field on here called ID, and this will be a string field. And this string field is going to be, it's going to hold a default value that MongoDB auto-generates. So to specify that, we'll go ahead and add default auto. So this lets Prisma know that it will be generated by the underlying database. The next thing that we'll need to do is add an ID attribute here, just to let Prisma know that within this model, this is the unique identifier. So that one's an important one there. And the next piece is actually mapping this column to the underlying underscore ID. So we don't want to call it underscore ID in our code because that just looks a little funky, and the regular just ID looks a lot cleaner when you're using like a JavaScript style API and nesting into objects. It looks a little bit cleaner that way. So we're going to call it ID in our actual schema and in our generated client. But in the underlying database, we'll tell Prisma that whenever we give Prisma the ID field on a user model, we're actually talking about the underscore ID field. And the very last piece that this is missing is a mapping to the native object ID type. So we have it specified here as a string. However, in MongoDB, there's a more specific type called db.objectID. And so that's a long line of different attributes, but this ID column here, or I guess field in a relational database sense, this field here is going to be a common one that you'll see when working with MongoDB and Prisma. This will need to be pretty much the exact same way set up on every collection that you define via a model. And now if we go back to our Notion document and take a look at the other pieces of data we want, let's go ahead and do the created at and updated at fields. So I'll go updated at, and this will be a date time. And Prisma has a nice updated at attribute here where what this will do is basically anytime a record is updated in your database, this updated at will update that record with a current timestamp so you know when a change was last made. And similar to this, we'll have a created at field, and this will be a date time as well. And this one will just have a default value of now. This is a function Prisma provides us. And what that's going to do is basically when a record is created, it'll default that value to now, and then it'll just stay that way. So you have a record of when the data was created. The next two fields, thinking back to our Notion document, are the email field, which is a string, and the password field, which is another string. So those ones are pretty simple, and all of the data we're going to be using in the schema today is going to be required. There will be no optional fields, but if you were to want to add an optional field, you could add the question mark here. Back over in the Notion document, the very last field that we're going to need to add is the profile. And this profile is an embedded document, and it's going to have a first name and last name within it. So let's see how we set that up in Prisma. In the schema over here, we have a type keyword, and that's how you set up a embedded document. And we'll call this profile. And then really similar to a model, we'll just set up a couple of fields in here. So we'll do the first name, which is a string, and the last name, which is another string. And now that we have that, we can essentially use this as a data type, and the Prisma engine and the Prisma schema language will basically let Prisma know that this means we have an embedded document. So if we add a new key here and give it the profile type, that will now define a embedded document on our collections fields. And so that's looking pretty good. We've got our user, we've got our embedded document, and I think that's all there was for this second task. And let's verify that. We'll look at the solution. And what we got looks pretty darn similar to this. So I think we're looking pretty good. The very last piece of the schema portion of this will be actually pushing our new collection to MongoDB. While there's no real concept of a migration in MongoDB, you still can push your changes because it'll actually create new collections and indexes that you define in your schema. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do npx Prisma and db push. And the reason we're using npx is because that'll just let Prisma know, or actually that'll just run a command with the specific version of Prisma installed in this project, rather than maybe a global one that you might have installed on your machine. So we'll do that. And so this is going to create the database collections, and it will regenerate Prisma client for us. So that's looking good. Looks like that completed. And the very last task that we're going to do on this first lesson is a pretty quick one. We're going to need to be able to access Prisma and use it within our application. However, because we are working in a development environment that has a live reload, we may run into the issue where we have a lot of connections being generated onto our database. And that's just because every time the development server reloads, it would likely reconnect to the database. So there's this snippet here that's been used all over the place. I got this from the Remix Run, their documents in their Jokes app. And this will just generate the Prisma client. It'll instantiate it and connect to it. And it'll make sure that if you're in a development environment, it doesn't connect multiple times. So if you want to just copy that code snippet over and go into your utils folder, and we'll add a new file here called prisma.server.ts, and just paste that snippet in. The contents of this aren't too important, except for the fact that it does export our instantiated Prisma client. And with that, it looks like the first lesson is complete here. And I think now is the portion of this workshop where I'll leave you guys to work through this first lesson. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut my camera off. I'll shut my mic off for a little while. And I'll give you guys probably around 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll say closer to around 10 minutes to go through these steps. And during that time, I might run off to grab a glass of water or something, but I will come back and monitor any comments in case anyone has some questions. So I will go ahead and mute myself and stop my video, and I'll be back in just a sec. All right, cool. And we're back. I know we have probably about 2 more minutes until the 10-minute mark would have come up, but I'm really excited and I want to get on to this next piece. So let's go ahead and pop open lesson number 2. The goal of this lesson is going to be really just to get comfortable with the Prisma Client API, specifically when working with Mongo. You're going to see a lot of the CRUD capabilities and the abilities to set up like relation queries and do different filtering and pagination options. And then, as it says here along the way, we're going to run another migration to introduce a second model that has a relation to the user's model eventually. So before we get to that step, though, we're going to, in this section, actually build out some of our functions to make part of our site functional. For the setup for this lesson, just make sure your development server is running. You can do that by running npm run dev in your project, and it'll pop open on localhost 3000. And as I had mentioned previously, as I'm going through this lesson, I do recommend you follow along and just watch and listen, and then code on yourself afterwards during the allotted time. And try to type the things out yourself when you're actually going through this instead of copying and pasting. I know for myself personally, that tends to help things stick in my brain a little bit more, and I tend to get a little bit deeper of an understanding of what's actually going on when I do that. But going down into these tasks, I have this split up into 2 sections. There's authentication and user management. And I have it split up this way because the functions that we'll be completing in the authentication section have to do with authenticating users and registering them. And the user management ones just have to do with updating users and fetching users for various queries that we'll do throughout our web application. So in task 1, it says complete the register function. And above that, we see that the functions for this task can be found in auth.server.ts. So let's pop that open and see what we're working with. If we open that here, we'll see we've got this register function. And currently, it just has some comments in it, and it has the static false data here. What this should do is it should check to see if a user exists with an email provided via the registration form. And we get that nice typing here. And if a user does exist, then it'll return an error. Otherwise, it'll go through and actually create the user and send you to the login screen. But right now we have this as static data, and we actually need to write a Prisma query here to determine if a user exists or not. So to start this off, I will import Prisma from, and this will go to the utils folder and our prisma.server file that we set up in the last lesson. And with that set up, we can actually use Prisma now. So this exists. We're going to actually use a count function here to count the number of records that exist with the email provided. And if the count is 0, then we're good. There's no email that exists in the database. Otherwise, if it is above 0, a user must exist with that email, and there's a problem. So let's write that out. We'll do await Prisma dot, and we can see the nice auto completion here. We're going to count our records, and we'll pass that an object. And we're going to count our records where the email matches user.email. And so now that's really all we need for this query. It's a pretty simple one, but it just shows how we get some of that nice auto completion even when working with a schema-less database. And this does return a number. So our Boolean check here should prove true or false. And I think actually that is, that's all that we needed to do for task 1. We just needed to fill in the rest of that function. And that's going to be the format for most of the tasks in the rest of the lessons for this workshop. We're going to get a function that's half complete, and we'll fill in the details we need to get it working the way we want it. If we check the solution here, that all looks good. Looks like we did all that correctly. And we can move on to task 2, which is completing the login function. Now, this function is a little bit different. So this function, if we pop it open over here, it's going to fetch a user. So we're passing it an email and a password from our login form, and it's going to check for a user with the email that we passed in. And if it finds one, it's going to create a user session and log you in so long as the password is correct. However, if it doesn't find one, it will return an error. Right now, it'll always find one because of this static data. So we need to actually update this. And there are some more specific details in the Notion document. Down here, I believe, replace the static user. Okay, no, so that's it. It's just adding the query for that unique user. And I have emphasized the fact that it's a unique user here because we are going to use a unique function. So we'll do, I'll comment this out for now. And we'll say that const user equals 08 prisma.user.find unique. And this find unique function is named as such because it allows you to filter your query on unique fields within your collection. So I'll do where, and we're going to do where the email matches our form.email. Or actually, no, it's not an inform object. It's just email here. And I think to make this a little bit easier, actually, we can do this here. And this is complaining. And the reason this is complaining, yeah, I was thinking that was a problem, but actually this was a point that I had intentionally messed up on so I could show you. This is complaining because email is not actually a unique field in our database. So it is complaining saying this isn't unique. This isn't one of the fields we have available. So instead, we would want to do a find first. And this will just find you one user where your email matches the email provided in the form. Cool, so I think that's all we need there. We can go back over to our Notion document and we'll look at the solution here. And this one does use a find unique because I think in the schema that I had defined in lesson 1, I had defined it as a unique value, but I may not have done that when I was setting it up. So I'll go ahead and actually add that here. I'll do npx prisma generate. Oops. npx prisma. And there we go. We've updated our schema to account for this new attribute there. So if we go back to our code, we can now use that find unique function and it'll stop complaining at us. And now we can select out the fields that we need for this, which as we see here are the ID field and the password field. We don't need any of the other data in this function, so we don't need to waste resources pulling out any additional data. So we'll select and we'll do ID true to let Prisma know we do want that, and password true. There, so that wraps up the login function. Now we're grabbing our user and we can continue processing afterwards correctly. And with those two functions done, we've wrapped up the authentication section and we can move on to the general user management. And most of these functions are going to be found in the users.server.ts file over here. Looking at this document, I think I had a typo here. I had the same file name, but it is going to be this user file. And the first task is to complete the create user function. There's currently a comment in there right now that shows where we should be creating the user. And what we need to do is actually build the query that will create the user and returns the ID and email. So let's go see what that would look like. We're getting our register form and we are hashing the password that we're getting from that form. And then we see our comment here. So we can do await prisma.user.create. And this automatically imported Prisma from the wrong location. We want to be accessing our instantiated version of it. So I'll update that. And with this, we can pass our create function some data. And we're going to pass it the email, which is user.email. We'll pass it the password, which is our hashed version of the password. And I'm hitting Control Space to get this auto completion. If you have, if you're in a TypeScript project, you do get these nice little features here. But I will now go into the profile. And this is an embedded document, and we can still update those right here. So we can do user.firstname, and last name is user.lastname. So this just shows how easy it is to use embedded documents and to create deeply nested data with the Prisma client without having to worry about how things are going to look in the underlying database when you store it. And then as specified in the Notion document, we do only want to have the email and the ID keys returned from this. So we'll select those out. Email, true, ID, true. And then rather than returning all of this data, we can just return ID, which would be, we'll actually store this in a variable so we can access that. I'll just say new user. And we can return the new user.id and the new user.email. And that looks good there. So we now have our create query in place, and we're returning the created data. So let's compare this to the solution to this task. And that's all looking good here. I think we pretty much nailed it. So we'll move on to the next one, which will be grabbing other users. And the reason this function is named this way is because we are going to be grabbing every user in the database except for the user that's currently logged into our website. And we'll get that user ID of that user via the request object in Remix. So to see what that looks like, let's go over to the function here. We're being passed in a user ID. So this will represent the user's ID who's currently logged in. And currently we're just returning an array of static data. And we need to be returning the results of an actual query. So let's add that here. We'll return await prisma.user.findMany. And within this find many, we will filter our results where the ID matches the user ID provided. And I believe we need to return a certain set of fields. So we're going to select the ID, the email, and the profile fields. And actually, my logic here is a little bit wrong. I have this filter where ID equals user ID. But if we're getting other users, we actually want where the ID does not equal the passed in ID. So to do that, we can use the not option in here and user ID. And that should look good. So now we can select out the bits of data that we want. And that'll be the ID, email, and the profile. And I think with that, that should do what we need for this query here. It's just grabbing all of those records and returning them from the function. And if we go back to the Notion doc again, we can compare this. And that looks good. And then there's this last little piece here, this order by. So I think it was specified up here, yeah, to order the results by the user's first name in ascending order. And we can do that using the order by key. And we're reaching into the profiles embedded document, and we're specifying we want to order the results by first name in ascending order. So I will add that over here. We'll reach into the profile, and we'll do first name in ascending order. So it's really cool how you can reach into those embedded documents and sort of give structure to your nested data and then perform processing on those. Okay, task 3, we're flying through these ones. Task 3 is to grab a user by their ID. So this is going to be a really similar function to some of the ones we've already written, except this will just grab a single ID whose ID matches a ID passed into our function. And the function is going to look like this here. So it's just going to return a single user where the ID matches. And so I'll just jump right into coding this one. This is going to look a lot like some of the other ones that we've already written. This will be await prisma.user.find unique. Again, we're using unique here because the ID column is a unique column on here, so we can actually use that. And we're getting our user, and then we want to select out some of the data that we want. By default, it will return all data, so we could just leave it like that. However, just for performance sake, we'll only retrieve certain fields like the ID, the email, and the profile. Cool, so that is going to be just about what we need here. Looks like we've got this all matched up properly, so we should be able to have the functionality in our website where a user ID is passed in, and we can grab the user's details from that. This gets to use all over on our website, wherever we're displaying a user's details, maybe in their profile settings modal or something like that. We'll be displaying those using this function. And this next function is update user. And what this is going to do is take in a user ID and an object that contains a user's profile details. And we want to update the user's embedded profile document with those details. And one of the cool things about Prisma is that when you set up your embedded documents and you generate Prisma client, it will actually generate typings for you for those. So we can import that into our project and use those to make sure we're getting the correct typed values. So to see that in action, we have our profile parameter here, and currently it's any. But if we go up to our import for Prisma, we can actually get the profile out. And if we hover over this, we can see it is typed to our embedded document. So that's pretty cool there. Now we can add that to this. And we can actually get working on the query. And what this query is going to do is we're not actually going to return anything from this function. It's just going to perform an action. So we'll await prisma.user.update. And we're going to update only a user where their ID matches the user ID passed into this function. And then we'll pass in some data. And let's see. Oh, it's because I put a semicolon instead of a colon. And for this data, we are only updating profile data. We don't need to update passwords or emails. So we will reach into profile, and then we'll use this update key. And this is a special key because we are working in an embedded document. We can either set it to completely replace the document or update it to update just specific fields. And that's the option we're going to want here. We'll pass in our profile object. And our update is complete. So now we're updating a user where the user ID matches the ID we passed in, and then we're giving it the new profile details. If we go over to here, we can look, and it looks like we got that all good. And we can move on to the very last function in this lesson, and that's the delete user. And what this function does is it takes in a user ID, and then our goal is to just delete the user related to that ID. So this is yet another one where we're not returning anything from the delete function. We're simply performing an action. So we'll do await prisma.user.delete, and we'll delete where the ID matches the ID that we've got passed in. And I am using the shorthand here. This could also be written as this, but this looks a little bit cleaner. And that's all we need to do there. This will currently delete our user. Later on, we're going to update sort of the process behind the scenes that happens when you delete a user to ensure referential integrity and get rid of any child data. But for now, this does what it needs to do. And if we look over at the Notion document, we've got that all good. So yeah, so that's all we had for lesson 2. At this point, you can start going through all of these on your own. If you run into any problems and need some help, feel free to leave a question in the Q&A section. And if you do get done a little bit early, at this point, you'll be able to actually register for your website and log in, and then you should be able to update your user details as well. So feel free to play around with that if you get finished before I come back. And I think for this one, I'll give just about 10 minutes again, and I will see you shortly. All right, I think we're at the 10-minute mark. If you didn't have enough time to finish anything in that lesson 2 section, feel free to go back whenever you would like and follow through with those. The instructions are there, so you should be able to go back pretty easily and get through those functions. But this next piece that we're going to do is actually update our schema to account for the rest of the data in our application, which is the Kudos related data. So the users are going to be able to send Kudos to and from each other, and we need to have a collection to store those and relate those to a user model. And then along the way, we're also going to set up referential actions so that if a user does get deleted, any Kudos that they have authored will get deleted along with them. That way we don't have data being stuck and sort of in a limbo state within our database. So let's get going on this. We don't need to do any setup for this section because we're already good to go. We have our Prisma schema set up and our project's running, so that should be fine as it is. And we'll just jump right into the very first task. And this task will be to add a couple of enums to our Prisma schema. When we send a Kudos through the website, you'll have the option to provide a couple of style options. So you can pick the background color of your Kudo, the text color, and also the emoji that'll show up in the bottom right corner of it. And we're going to set up some enums so that we can define which values are actually valid in our database. And this is pretty cool, though, because this isn't a native feature of MongoDB. This is something that Prisma abstracts over it, and it allows us to define some of these more rigid guidelines with our data. So to do that, we'll go into our Prisma schema. And we'll pop open the schema file here. And I'll go down a couple of lines and I will add an enum block with the enum keyword here. And the very first one that we're going to add, we're going to do the color one. And this is going to be kind of similar to how these types are set up, where we don't really have to have a unique key because this just defines a set of data. However, there is going to be no type for our fields in this. It's just going to have the values. And I think I have the values specified in this document. So we're going to have red, green, yellow, blue, and white, all caps. So I'll just type those out real quick. And there we go. So we can use those in the next task to define what our styles colors should look like. But we do need to add one more first, and that's the emoji enum. And we only have a couple options for this. We have the thumbs up option, the party option, and we have, I think it was hands up. Yeah, we've got the hands up option. And those are the only two enums that we're going to need in our schema here. So actually, when we generate Prisma client, it will generate types for these enums so that when we are interacting with Prisma client and updating this data, we can actually get a nice auto-completed list of possible values. So that's a really cool feature and really helps organize and define that rigid structure for your data that you might need when working with Mongo in a bigger project. But I think with that, we've wrapped up task 1. I'll just check the solution to make sure I didn't miss anything. And we're looking pretty good here. And we can move on to the second task. And this is where we're going to add the actual Kudo model. And this model is going to be pretty special because it'll have some relationships defined on it, but we'll get into that piece next. We're just going to set up the basic structure of it for now. It's going to have an ID column, as every collection will need to have in MongoDB. And then it will have a message, which is the actual message a user can type and send to another user. And we'll have this created at timestamp that gets used in the application in the filtering option of the feed and the sorting option there so that we can actually order our results by when they were created. And then finally, similar to the profile embedded document on the user model, we're going to have a style embedded document, and it'll have these options using our enums as their data types. So let's go into the schema. And I'll go up here to where the models are, and I'll add a new model called Kudo. And for this, I'm just going to copy this ID field over because it's going to be exactly the same. And we can start typing in the rest of our fields. The first one is our message, which is a string. And we had the created at field. That's going to be exactly the same as the user one as well. So I'll copy that guy over also. And then we have our style embedded document, and we'll add that right under here. And it'll just be called Kudos style. And what this is going to have is a background color key. And that's of the color type. We'll have a text color key, and that's also of the color type. And then it'll have an emoji, and that will be of the emoji type. And these refer to our enums down here. And so we have this embedded document defined, but we're not actually using it anywhere yet. So let's give it to our Kudo model. We'll add a style field to this model, and it'll be of the type Kudo style. And so that's cool. That's the basic structure of our Kudo. There's not a whole lot of data that goes into it, just a couple of those options you see there. And I believe that finishes up task 2. Actually, no, it doesn't. So there's a couple of things that I guess I had forgotten to put in the instructions here. We are going to be setting some default values on our styles here. That way we don't have any unstyled Kudos. And we can do that using the default attribute, and we can pass it the value of the enum that we want to be the default value. So I'll actually just copy this over. And this is why we have solution blocks, because little things like that can slip through the cracks pretty easily. But there we go. So we've got our defaults defined, and this is actually pretty cool because this allows you to even further enforce your structure in embedded documents in this schemaless sort of environment. Without this, you would be able to add like maybe an empty object or even not provide an object, and nothing would complain. MongoDB would recognize that as a valid JSON object with valid data types. And so nothing would go wrong unless you were using something like JSON schema in MongoDB. However, with this in place, we can actually ensure in our application layer that we are providing a data type that we would expect, and that makes the most sense for our application. So that's a pretty cool feature, and that's one of the really powerful strengths of using Prisma with MongoDB. But now let's go ahead and move to the next piece. And this is one of the bigger pieces in our schema. We're going to be setting up author and recipient relationships between a Kudo and a user. And what I mean by that is a user can actually author many Kudos. They could send many messages to however many users they want. And so this will be like a one-to-many relationship. You'll have one user who owns many Kudos. And then you'll have a similar relation to that. It'll be another one-to-many where you have a recipient of Kudos. So when we actually send a Kudo, we're going to need to define a way to connect that Kudo to an author and to its recipient. And we're defining it in a way where Prisma Client will know how to build its querying types and querying API for you to make querying that data really simple. And so if we look down here, the naming of a lot of these fields is super important in this application because it is a fully fleshed out application already. It's going to be expecting some certain names. And so I've gone ahead and added those names here, and I will walk through in a second what exactly those will look like in the Prisma schema. But I will say when you're working through this piece on your own, keep these names in mind and be sure to use those. Otherwise, your application is going to get some field names that it's not really expecting. But let's go ahead and actually get started on setting up these relations. If we go into our user model, we know that we're going to have, actually, I'm going to look at the names here real quick. There we go, authored Kudos. So we know we're going to have a lot of Kudos that have been authored by an individual user. So I'm going to call it authored Kudos. And this will be of the Kudo type. It's going to have an array of Kudos. So this is basically defining a one-to-many relationship. Our user is going to be related to many Kudos. And we'll give this relationship a name because we are going to be setting up two relations between the user and the Kudo models. Because we're setting up two relations between the same exact models, we do need to name our relation. That way Prisma has a way to differentiate between the different connections there. So I'll say relation, and I'll use the name provided over here in the Kudos document. So we'll call this one authored Kudos. And then the very next piece is a similar line of code. So I'll just copy this one down and modify it as necessary. The next field on our user schema here is going to be just Kudos. And this is going to be the list of Kudos that a user has received. So we'll also rename this to received Kudos. And this is a one-to-many relationship as well. So obviously one user can have many Kudos. And we see this is complaining. And if we hover over it, it's going to say that we are missing a opposite relation field on the Kudo model. And that makes sense because we've defined our relationship on this end, but we don't know how to define that relationship coming from the Kudos perspective. So let's add that relationship here. And I'll peek back over at the Notion document to see what we named that relationship. Our field names on the Kudo model should be author, author ID, recipient, and recipient ID. So those make sense. I'll go ahead and add the author one. And this will be of the user type. And this is going to be a relation. And the way I'm going to set this up is I'm going to add references. So we want to know which fields in the user model that this relationship is going to reference to determine which record it's related to. So in the user model, we want to point to the ID field. And then within the Kudo model itself, we want to be sure to point to another field that we're going to call author ID. That doesn't exist yet, but it will in just a second. And finally, because we did name our relations up here, we need to provide that name down here as well, so that we know which relation is pointing to which field down here below. And that all looks good. The last piece we need is that author ID. So we will add a new column for that. And this will be a string. And more specifically, it's going to be a object ID because it will be a ID generated by MongoDB with the underlying object ID type. And so this relation is done, it's defined, and we can see this has stopped complaining. So we're all good there. We now have the ability to have a user with many authored Kudos. And I will actually copy this guy over and paste it here because we're going to use a lot of the same structure to set up recipients, except we'll just change a couple of the namings. So this will be the recipient relation. So we'll call it recipient in our model. And this should reference a field called recipient ID within the Kudo model itself. And in the user model, it's going to actually point to the ID still because it's going to be pointed. Whatever the recipient ID's value is should match what the ID up here is in the user model. So that looks good. Now we can add our name here and update this guy to recipient ID. And that completes the relations. So we now have a way to get from a user down to its many Kudos and to get from a user down to its many authored Kudos. And I think if I remember correctly, that's all we needed to do for this third task is just set up those relations. And let me verify that. Yep, so we're looking good here. Awesome, we have those defined. And we can move on to the next step, which is task 4, putting our referential actions in place. And to do that's pretty simple, but I'll first explain what that means a little bit. Right now we have a user who can create many Kudos. And we have a problem though, where if we do delete a user, we don't have anything defined letting our application know what to do with the Kudos that belonged to that user. And natively, MongoDB doesn't have a way to manage this. It doesn't have a way to automatically delete any data that might become orphaned when a parent relationship is deleted. And so Prisma has a nice feature called referential actions, where you can actually define those actions within your schema here, and Prisma will handle that as things change. So let's go in our author relationship actually, and we'll do on delete. So what we're essentially saying is when the user related to this Kudo is deleted, we want to cascade that event down to the Kudos as well. And so that's a really simple change, but it does do a very strong feature Now, if a user is ever deleted and it has a bunch of kudos, those kudos will be deleted as well, and we won't have all of that stale data living in our database. And I think that's all we needed to do for this guy. Yep, that looks good. And with that, we have our data all modeled out to handle our kudos. And we now just need to regenerate Prisma client to account for these changes. And we're actually going to do a DB push here because we did create a new collection. If we had not created a new collection or index, if we had just added maybe embedded types or enums, there'd be no need to do a DB push because there's no schema we're pushing to on the Mongo database side. Instead, we're just updating the Prisma client. But in this case, we did add a new collection, so we need to make MongoDB aware of that. So we'll do npx Prisma DB push. And we can see here we got our output here that says we did create that new collection. And if you remember, I added that email unique flag on the email address field here, sort of after the fact. So it now picked that up and said, hey, I've created this new index in MongoDB for you. So that's super cool. And I think with that, we are done with this third section. And so I'll go ahead and leave you guys to go through these tasks and follow through these on your own. And once you're done, we will get on to the lesson 4, which will be the final piece where we wrap up all the queries for this application, and we'll have a full website. But before I sign off for a couple of minutes here, I do want to remind everybody that there's a raffle today, and we are raffling off Atlas credits. So that'll be monetary value credits for an Atlas database. And I don't recall actually what the monetary value of that is right now. I don't know if maybe one of the other co-hosts on here can chime in via the chat, or if not, maybe I can get some of those stats while I'm away and I'll remind you when I come back. But yeah, so keep that in mind, and we will be announcing that closer to the end. So for now, I'm going to turn off my mic and camera, and I'll be back in just about 10 minutes. All right, our 10 minutes is almost up, but I'm popping on a little bit early. I did get some confirmation on the Atlas credits. What that's actually going to be is I have a code, and I will be pasting that in the chat right now. And feel free to use that code to get access to, I think each of them is $50. It's a $50 credit to your Atlas account. So I'll post that in the chat right now and go ahead and use that. Cool. I'll give you guys a second to go ahead and copy that over, and then I'll get going on the final section here. All right, so jumping into this fourth page here, this fourth and final page. The remainder of this is going to be just fleshing out the rest of our application now that we've defined the rest of our data model in our Prisma schema. So the goal of this is just going to be completing the application. We're going to add the ability to display and query for your Kudos, and those will be displayed on your homepage's feed. And then there's a sorting option and filtering option up at the top in the search bar. So we'll be building out the ability to provide those sort and search filters to your query. The setup for this will be very similar to the second one. All you have to do is make sure you can run npm run dev and get your site up and running. And the same hints as before, try not to copy paste any of these solutions. If you can avoid it, it would be better if you type those out on your own, because you'll get some more context into how things are working and a little bit deeper of an understanding of why things are working. So jumping into the tasks here, we're going to go into our code and open the kudos.server.ts file. This file is where all of the functions relating to a Kudos lives and to our Kudos feed. And we're going to jump into the create Kudo function. This is the very first function on that file. And what this function is doing is it's being provided all of the data needed to create a new Kudo. And our job is going to be to write a query to create a new document in the database with that data, while keeping in mind that we have author and recipient relations to connect to each Kudo. And then we are going to make use of some of Prisma's generated types to make sure that our Kudo style embedded document is typed when we run this query. So when we pass the style object, we're going to use that generated type to make Prisma happy and let it know that we know which type we're passing in. So let's go ahead and jump into that. I'm going to pop open my code over here, and I'll go into kudos.server.ts. And within here, we have a bunch of these functions, and the one that we're concerned with right now here is create Kudo. It's currently empty. It's being passed a bunch of parameters, as I'd mentioned, but we're not doing anything with those. And this function does not need to return anything. It just performs an action and goes on its way. So let's start writing our query. This will be a create action. So we'll do await prisma.kudo.create. And this is, that's complaining because I didn't import Prisma from the right place again. The auto import has been killing me today, but that's no problem. We can just import it from the right place here. And now we're getting the properly typed Prisma client object. So we are going to create a new Kudo. We're going to pass it some data. And the first piece of data will be our message value. And I'm just going to use the shorthand rather than writing message : message. That seems a little repetitive to me, so I will use the shorthand for that. And then we need to consider our author and recipient relations. So to add those, there's actually a really simple way to connect those with the Prisma client. If you hit Control Space, you can see all of your options here. I'm going to hit author, and that'll be an object. And then we get these options. We can either connect to an existing author. We can run sort of an upsert where it would either connect to an existing author or create it if one didn't already exist. Or we can just go ahead and actually create a new author here without even looking for an existing one. The one that we're going to want is this connect option, because Because this is creating a Kudo, we can assume that there is a logged in user who already exists in the database, and we just need to connect to that user. And we'll be connecting it on the ID, and we'll pass that our user ID. So at this point, when we create our Kudo, it's going to set up that relation for us where any author with this ID will be related to this Kudo. And I will copy this guy down because that's going to be the same setup that we're going to use for the recipient relation, except we would type in recipient here. And this ID won't be the user ID. We want to connect it to the recipient's ID. And so that looks good. We've set up our relations. These are connecting properly, but this still looks like it's complaining. And that's because we're not passing it our style object yet. And in our schema here, if we look at this style, it is a required field. Nothing is optional in this schema. So Prisma is letting us know that there's a piece of data that the database is expecting, but we're missing it. And this style is currently of the type any, which is not going to be ideal if we wanted to do any sort of digging into the style properties in there. That would not give us any help. So what we can actually do is go up here and we can import Kudos style. And that's just a type that Prisma generated for us based off of our embedded document. And so I'll slap that over this, this any type, and now we've got the properly typed style object. That's probably a little overkill for what we're doing here. We're not going to need to drill into any of those properties, but I mostly just wanted to highlight the fact that these types are available to you if you need them. To put that to use, though, we'll go ahead and give this style, and we should be good there. And I think if I'll look over this real quick. We're creating the Kudo, we're giving it the message and style, we're connecting the author and recipient. So that looks like we're all good. This create Kudo function is complete. And let's go look at the solution and make sure we got this all right. So we had to import Prisma client, we imported Kudo style, and all of this looks good. So I think we're good here, and we can move on to the next function. This next function is called get recent Kudos. And what this is going to do is it'll grab the most recent 3 Kudos that were sent in your website. And this is going to be used for the recent Kudos panel that shows up on the very right side of your homepage once you've logged into the website. And this function is going to be a little bit more complex. We're going to give it a couple more options that will sort of highlight how you can start to skip data and take only certain counts of data. But the goal of this will be to grab just the emoji from your Kudos and to grab the recipient's ID and profile information so we can render those onto the screen. So if we go back to our code over here, and if we scroll down to our get filtered Kudos, we can see we have this started off. We're returning a static array, and we just need to update the function there. So I'll go ahead and clear all of this out. And we're going to return a new query. It will be prisma.kudo, and we're going to use the find many because we are trying to get many records. And the way we filter this is going to be a little bit different than we have done in the past. So this is going to, well, actually, oh, there we go. I'm in the wrong function. I'll back all this up. That's my bad. I was wondering what all these params were here for, and it's because we don't actually need those. So we're looking here, actually. Here we're going to get the most recent Kudos. And all this is going to do is return a query. And we are still doing a find many, so that's still the same. And we want to only return the top 3 records. So we're actually going to order our results by the created at field. And we'll do that in descending order. So this is going to order them from newest to oldest. And then once those are ordered, we're going to take the top 3 from that. That way we get the 3 most recent kudos. And then we'll specify which data we actually care about to return from this. And as we saw in the Notion document, we want to reach into the style embedded document. And we're going to select out the emoji. We don't really need the background color and the text color because we're not displaying a kudo. This is just for the user's profile display. And because we are going to be displaying a user, we'll want the recipient data. And we will also select out some data from that. We'll get the ID of the user. And we will get the, what is it? We'll get the profile. And that's all we needed to do here. This should return our top 3 most recent records and give us just the data that we need. And that all looks good. So if we go over to the Notion document and we look at the solution for this guy, we can see that we got this pretty much spot on. So that's awesome. Now that we've got that done, we can move on to the third and the final function here. And this one's going to be a little bit more complex than all of the previous ones had been. So this one might take a little bit longer, but it looks like we've got the time for it. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So this function is going to take in a bunch of different parameters, and we see those here. We get user ID, we have a sort filter, and a where filter. And what these do is, well, for some more context, actually, this function is what gets used to display the kudos on our feed. And when we perform any sort of filtering or sorting on our feed, it's going to rerun this function and grab the newest set of data based off our filters. And because it is displaying a individual user's feed, we're giving it a user ID so that we know which user to grab the data for. And we'll use the sort filter and where filter parameters to add to the filter that we're going to build up in our query. And here's what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and actually start to build this. So if we do, we're returning a Prisma query, and we'll search for any kudos. And we're going to do a find many here again. If I could type that out. There we go. Excuse me. And in this find many, we are going to have a where clause. And we want to make sure that we're getting all of the kudos where the recipient, where the recipient ID matches the user ID we pass into it, because we're going to be searching for a specific recipient's feed of kudos. So that's good there, but we also need a way to add other filters from the search bar. And what we're going to actually do is we're going to destructure our where filter into here. And while this isn't a completely necessary step, I do want to point out that we can actually strongly type this in case we wanted to add maybe more to the filter and pass it into this function. Right now, we're giving it an any type. So it's allowing us to do this because it might be the right type. But if we did want to strongly type this, all we'd have to do is import the Prisma namespace, which gets generated with the Prisma client. And then, for example, on our where filter here, we would do a kudo where input. And if we look at what that looks like, this is just the entire set of types for any where clause that we add into our query. So that's cool. I've used this quite a bit. There's actually a couple places in this application's code that does use the namespace types. If you're curious about those, feel free to just do a full text search for capital case Prisma dot, and you should see where I'm using those. But I'm also going to do something similar here. We'll do Prisma, and this one's a little bit more crazy. This is the kudo order by, I think it's with relation input. Let's see. Order by with relation input. There we go. And what this is saying is that this object is going to be the same shape as a typical order by for a kudo, except it's also going to take into account possible relation inputs that you might be ordering by. So that's a pretty cool one there. We'll go ahead and put that to use by going sort filter, and we can just use that variable right here, sort filter. And so we're filtering our data and we are ordering our data. And I think the last piece we need to do here is actually let Prisma know which columns we care about returning. So we'll use the select for that again. And we'll pull out the ID and the style and the message, because we are going to want to display the message on our feed. And then finally, the Kudos component does display a little preview of the author of the Kudo. So we need to get some of the author's profile details. So we'll go into the author. And that's going to look for the author that is connected to this Kudo. And so we'll have to select the data out of that. And we'll select the profile data and set that to true. And so that's quite a bit bigger of a query. It's a little bit more complex, and we've used some of these types here to help build up a far more complex, possibly variable set of filters and order bys. But once we run this, we should see that we are now getting filtered sets of data in our feed and ordered sets of data in our feed. And I'll go over to the Notion document and just verify that we've accomplished everything that we wanted to. And I think we did. It looks like we've got what's matching up there. So with that, our application is finished. We have successfully revitalized this nice website we have here. We've saved it from the pits of static data and given it a nice live feel, and it's now completely functional. So that's super cool. I was really excited to go through this application. I've spent the last couple of weeks building this Kudos application, and I've been just really hyped to walk through some of the ways that Prisma made this much easier. I know as I built this application, I had worked with MongoDB quite a bit previously without using an ORM, and even with using a couple of different ORMs. But once I started digging into the way Prisma adds support for maybe non-native features that MongoDB doesn't have by default, and then just the way it sets up relations and allows you to define your structure on the application layer, it makes things so much more simple and a lot more easy to keep in your head. And so with that, I would suggest you go through the lesson 4 on your own. And if you run into any issues, I do have all of these modes of communication down here. Definitely feel free to shoot me a message. I'm on all of these channels pretty much all day, so I can usually respond really quickly, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions or even just any comments you might have about the application or the thought process behind some of this stuff. So yeah, with that, I will leave you to the rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us on this. It was super fun, and I hope to do this again sometime, so thank you.